As most of you know, Cleantech San Diego was formed 10 years ago. We'll actually be celebrating our 10-year anniversary next year. So expect a big party of some sort. I don't know what that looks like yet now, but we'll figure it out. But we were formed 10 years ago to support the development of the clean tech and renewable energy sector here in San Diego. And today, the San Diego region, as we talked about at our last event, ranks number 3 in the country in terms of its leadership for clean technology and renewable energy. And a lot of that is because of the folks here in the room and all the work that you're doing. In fact, we were just this past weekend, we just hosted the world's largest electric vehicle day at Qualcomm. I think we had over 1,000 participants there, partnered with SDG&E and the Center for Sustainable Energy and others. Dan, we're going to put you in the middle over there. But anyway, just had a great turnout, and so I think it's really a testament to the adoption of electric vehicles and really our region's effort to really change the way that we do things. And so this morning, this is again part of our quarterly event where we gather our members, Cleantech San Diego members, please raise your hand. Thank you very much. Those that did not raise your hand, you should feel ashamed. So see me afterwards. But really to gather to have dialogues about what's happening here in our region. And today's topic is one that is obviously very important to all of us, otherwise we wouldn't be here. I will note there's a small change in the agenda. The part of Jim Avery is going to be played by Tom Brill today with SDG&E, but we're still in capable hands. So we've got a lot to say today. We have a lot of great speakers. You have a program in front of you. So let's get started. I want to introduce our partner this morning and the moderator of today's event, Mark Hooley with CohnReznick. As many of you know, CohnReznick is one of the top accounting, tax, and advisory firms in the U.S., combining the resources and technical expertise of a national firm with hands-on entrepreneurial approach. Mark is actually the practice leader for the firm's renewable energy industry on the West Coast and has more than 15 years of experience providing auditing and consulting services to publicly traded and closely held companies. His renewable energy and clients include investors, independent power producers, EPCs, and other clean technology companies. And most importantly, he serves on the board of directors for Cleantech San Diego. So Mark, this is all in your hands from here on. Good luck.
Thank you. Good morning, Cleantech San Diego. It's 8:30 a.m. It's a Monday. Look at this incredible crowd. There's no better way to start off a week than to talk about solar in San Diego. On behalf of myself and on behalf of my firm, CohnReznick, we're delighted to sponsor this event with Cleantech San Diego. On a personal note, I moved here about 2 years ago from the DC metropolitan area. And I spent a great deal of time in the Northeast in the renewable energy industry, and in particular, focused on the role that distributed solar plays in those markets. I cannot stress enough how incredible the renewable energy industry is here in San Diego, and in particular, the prevalence and relevance of distributed solar. That said, we do have our challenges. The state of California and San Diego have super aggressive renewable energy targets, as you know. And the key question here is, how do we meet these targets, and do our current policies and infrastructure align with our vision? It's going to take collaboration across all stakeholders, including utilities, policymakers, solar companies, and all of us as consumers to make this work. The good news is that our panelists today, I believe, have all committed to solve these problems today, this morning. Or maybe Jason was the one that committed on your behalf. But maybe we're not going to solve all these problems, but we have some of the brightest minds here in San Diego this morning to discuss where we have been, to debate current policies, and to discuss our path moving forward to meet our future goals. So a couple of notes here. There will be time for questions at the end. What we are going to do is Jason and Shannon, I think, are going to pass around cards if you just raise your hand throughout. And take a card, write down your question, and then we're going to ask all those at the end, time permitting. And then we have a really cool feature for today's program. To our first 150 attendees, which I think is everybody here. Looks like we had a few cancellations. You should all have a clicker in your hands, or at least it was as part of on your seat. And this is going to be used for our interactive polling program throughout this morning's program. So this will be used to take a pulse of the audience and then also to garner feedback from our panelists on key issues. So I think you're really going to enjoy the interactive polling. All right, on to our first speaker. I'd like to introduce Scott Anders. Scott is the director of the Energy Policy Initiatives Center at USD School of Law. He joined EPIC in October 2005 as its inaugural director and developed both its academic and research programs. Scott's work at EPIC has focused on regulatory and policy issues relating to developing efficient and low-carbon energy sources. So without further ado, please welcome Scott up to the podium.
Well, good morning, everyone. I noticed the strange weather we had in the last, I don't know, was that 12 hours? Anybody hear that thunder last night? That was crazy. It woke me up in the middle of the night. So I think it's an apt metaphor for our conversation today. I think the past discussions of solar have been contentious. I think that the thunder and lightning symbolizes that. And I think the future is uncertain, and I think that's symbolized by this nice thick fog we have along the coast here. So I think that's the weather has teed this up nicely. I'm going to provide kind of a, let's see, I can tell you what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about how we got here and maybe set a little bit of the context for the discussion we're going to have from the other speakers and then from the question and answer period. You heard a little bit about EPIC. We were founded in 2005. Our mission is to conduct research and analysis on energy policy related issues. We educate decision makers and students on these issues. A lot of people ask where we get our funding. About half of our funding comes from internal. We have an endowment, so we have income from the endowment plus grants and contracts. A quick sketch of who we are. All right, this is I wish I could have worked this into the clicker process, but I didn't. So I came to San Diego in 1999. One of my first projects here was working with builders, new home construction, solar and new home construction. Does anybody have a sense in 1999 how much solar we had in San Diego County, in SDG&E service territory? Ballpark. Anyone? 500 kilowatts. Anyone else? How about 10 systems, about 33 kilowatts? How about today? People probably know this number a little bit better. How much do we have today? That's true. We have over 90,000 systems, over 600 megawatts. Now, I'm not saying that there's a causation or correlation with my arriving to San Diego and my being here. I'm just saying that this is how we've progressed. So I think what I want to talk about is, how did this happen? I mean, if you think about those numbers, that's pretty extraordinary. That's a big jump. Now, it took some time, but the curve is pretty steep. And what are some of the implications of that growth? So this is perhaps a simplification, but work with me. I think all of this stuff is more complicated than we could talk about in 10 or 15 minutes. But in general, there's kind of a recipe for success here. One is net metering. I'm going to talk about all of these things individually, but one is net metering, one is financial incentives, and the other one is electric rates. You add those three together in the right proportions, and you get 600 megawatts of solar, 90,000 systems. There are some other things in here. There's some innovation on the part of the companies who responded to all these things. There's business models like third-party financing. I'm going to kind of omit that for the moment, and I'm going to kind of say these are the key things. Without these, those other things wouldn't have happened. So that's kind of my premise here. Okay, net metering. Quick overview. Net metering 1.0, we'll call this. So I think folks have a sense of what net metering is, but let's just talk about it for a second, because I think we're going to get into this in part of the dialogue going forward. So think about net metering as a debit account. When your solar system is producing more than you're consuming in your home, you're actually making a deposit into an account. And then at night, you pull that out. And this happens, all day long, all week long, all month long. At the end of the month, your credits and debits get kind of trued up, and you either have produced more or less than you consumed in that period. So energy debit account, just think about net metering like that. Probably the most important thing about net metering is that you get credited at the retail rate. Very important point. You get credited at the rate you would have paid for that energy. So that's a key point that we're going to come back to. There is a system cap, or I should say there's a cap on net metering. So in the state of California, it's 5% of aggregate customer demand. Again, we're going to come back and talk about that in a second as well. But so debit account, retail rates, and there's a cap. So San Diego has been at the forefront, I would say the cutting edge of solar policy in the state. We have consistently met the net metering cap every time there ever was a cap. So this is a quick timeline. 1995, the original net metering is born in legislation. 0.1% of system peak demand was the cap. 2002, the cap is raised because San Diego is meeting the cap. 2005, the cap is raised only for San Diego because we're so close to the cap and the legislature is not fast enough to keep up with us, so they gave us a little bit of headroom. SB 1 in 2006 then raised the cap. Then again in 2010, cap is raised again. And then in 2013, AB 327 codified those increases. So again, 5% of aggregate peak demand. And now there was some fancy footwork on the part of some folks, and I think it was pretty interesting. All along, historically, on this side of this chart, we thought 5% or whatever percent meant of the utilities system peak. In other words, the highest peak that the system achieves. Somewhere, somehow along the line, it turned into aggregate customer peak demand. And somebody said, well, what does that mean? And somebody else responded by saying, well, that means you add up all of the customer peaks, and that's aggregate peak demand, which is about twice as much as you get as if you did SDG&E system peak. So again, I'm not sure if that was rhetorical sleight of hand or what, or just good interpretation, or just poor legislative drafting, or maybe very clever legislative drafting. But nonetheless, when Public Utilities Commission interpreted that, the 5% of system peak demand actually, in terms of how much solar we could use, doubled the peak effectively. Oh, let me back up real quick. So, in July of this summer-ish, SDG&E hit the peak of 617 megawatts. I don't know where we are today. Maybe Tom Brill from SDG&E or other folks know that, but we're over 617. I don't know the exact number, but we're over 617 megawatts. I mentioned AB 327, very important piece of legislation. As I said, it codifies that 5% of aggregate peak demand. It also requires the Public Utilities Commission to come up with something after the cap is met. So now we have a system, there's a cap, what happens after the cap? And again, we are on the front lines of this. We were going to be the first ones here in San Diego to get this what's next. It opens the door for fixed charges. So let's talk about that for a second. The utility, I guess not all industries, but most industries have different types of costs. So you have fixed costs and you have variable costs. So if you think about a water utility, electric utility, or your cell phone company, there are certain things that they build and they become fixed costs. So we all have on our cell phone, we all pay a customer charge. It's effectively a fixed charge. But on the electric side, depending on what type of customer you are, you may, so for example, if you're a residential customer, you pay all of your energy you pay all of your rates in terms of energy. Now, some of the fixed costs are baked in, but not explicitly called out, so to speak. Big issue, and we're going to talk about that in a second. I'm sure this is going to be a huge part of our discussion here today, is are customers paying their fair share for fixed charges? That's a question. And I'm not sure whether and or the lightning and the fog apply to that one, but I'm pretty sure both of them do. The Public Utilities Commission came up with what they call a net energy metering successor tariff. There's nothing sexy about the words that the Public Utilities Commission uses. Net energy metering successor tariff. So this one kind of changes the rules a little bit. For smaller systems, there's a one-time interconnection fee now, and customers will have to pay non-bypassable charges. Again, perfectly clear term what a non-bypassable charge is. But basically what a non-bypassable charge is a charge you can't get around. Everybody has to pay it. And if you're a solar customer, currently under net metering 1.0, you don't pay non-bypassable charges. So that would be, for example, if you look on your bill, you have, the energy commodity you purchased, you have transmission, distribution, and then you have all these other things. Mostly all those other things are non-bypassable charges. Competitive transition charge, nuclear decommissioning charge, et cetera, et cetera. Big long list of so-called non-bypassable charges. Residential customers will have to use a time of use rate, and that's a new change. That's a big change. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But this is what's coming after the current system. And actually, when I say that, we are in that now. So new customers are in this new regime. Okay, so that's net metering. There's a lot, that's a tip of the iceberg. There's a lot of net metering ice under the water here. I'm going to talk a bit about financial incentives, rates, and then we're going to get on our way here. So I was timing myself. How am I doing here? Come on. I just did my update and I can't log into my phone. Financial incentives. Another leg of the stool that led to 600 megawatts in San Diego. California Solar Initiative, basically, in a nutshell, 10-year program, $2 billion to provide financial incentives to spur the market in distributed solar. And the interesting thing about this one is the way that it was designed. It was designed in a way to decline over time to kind of. Sorry, that was. See, even Siri can't make sense of all this. This is crazy. So it declines over time. It was a lump sum incentive. Some were performance based, but again, think of this as cash. This is helping you get over the first cost hump. And this is out of the most recent Public Utilities Commission report on the California Solar Initiative. I think this is all interconnected systems. And, a couple things are interesting here. One is that top line number of 3570 megawatts in 2015. That's statewide, not just San Diego, obviously. But look how steady that growth is. Now, it's pretty steep on the right side, but some would argue that that was due in part by the design of the California Solar Initiative, that it was designed in a way to create kind of a rational growth in the marketplace so that we didn't get too fast, it wasn't too slow. It's kind of the Goldilocks growth of solar in the state. And I mean, I'm not saying it is or isn't, but you can see that we kind of went along, we added some, and now we're in this pretty steep growth on the right. And by the way, there are no incentives left. They're basically, for most customers, you're not getting those California Solar Initiative. So in a way, it worked. It created the market. It weaned the industry off of at least those incentives and led to significant growth. One of the goals of the California Solar Initiative was to bring down price. Now this is U.S. This is the U.S., not just California. But prices have come down significantly over the last, how many years is it? It's a long time, 20, 30 years. So prices have come down pretty dramatically. Again, not only because of the policies in California. There are a lot of factors that led to this drop. But this is the latest Lawrence Berkeley National Lab Tracking the Sun 9. I think it just came out in August. So prices have come down. So this is, I would say, a result of, in part, the policies. Also, lots of other things happening. Again, I don't want to simplify it. Another thing that I don't talk about, I'm not going to talk about here, but I do want to mention, are the federal investment tax credits. Play a huge role. Don't want to underplay those, but wanted to focus a bit more on the California policy side. Okay, electric rates. I couldn't think of a more boring topic to talk to you about on Monday morning than electric rates. But electric rates, if you're in the solar business, if you're in the energy storage business, if you're in almost any electric consumer-related energy part of the industry, and you don't understand rates, you're crazy. Electric rates are the driver of the cost effectiveness of all these things. So if you don't understand rates, you better check your business plan. So I mentioned earlier net metering. Net metering isn't a rate in and of itself. Net metering sits on top of the rate structure. It just is this accounting and billing system that says if you generate more than you need, you kind of get a credit for that. But what you get credited at is the underlying rate. So the underlying rate is very important. I think it's safe to say that rates in California in the last 15 years have been pretty complicated. Again, lightning, fog, these are really good analogies. AB1X was right after the energy crisis. People might remember the energy crisis. Rates were going through the roof. Policymakers were trying to figure out how to stop the patient from bleeding, so to speak. And one of the things they did is they put a cap on upper tier rates. So remember we used to have 4-tier rates this is residential rates. So this chart on the right, the blue lines shows in, I think it was 2001, what the original tiered rate structure looked like. You know, there were tiers, they slowly went up over time. The upper rates, the lower two, the left-hand two, were capped. And all increased costs went into the upper tiers. And you can see that over time, those top two red bars, those are the upper tiers. And so they kept growing when the lower tiers were fixed. And now there were some arguments about we're doing this for conservation. Those higher bars encouraged conservation. By the way, they also encouraged, they were also the target, I should say, for smart solar marketers who said, hey, if you're in those tiers and you're paying 30 or 40 cents, and I forget exactly what year this was with those rates, but it wasn't that long ago, you should have solar. Like that's what the companies were saying. So the underlying rates were critically important. The problem is that now you have, you can see where this is going, right? If you should have let this go, you would have lower rates at the, 15-cent rate, and you'd have upper rates in the 50, 60 cent. It became unsustainable. The legislature passed AB 327, which said, hey, we need to figure out a way to get this rate system under control. So that there was a decision from the PUC for rate reform. It rejected fixed monthly charges, although it doesn't preclude them in the future. Again, fixed charges, probably going to talk about that a lot over the next 30 minutes or so. It provided a glide path to consolidate those 4 tiers down into 2, I believe. It's 2 tiers over time. It introduced the concept of a minimum bill. It authorized time of use pilots, and it sort of set the stage for time of use rates for residential customers in the not too distant future. So, residential rate reform is it's a big deal. Introducing time of use rates is also, I think, a pretty big deal. So I think there are some questions. I'm not going to provide answers, but I kind of want to throw them out, maybe spark discussion, maybe hope to get some perspectives from the other panelists. So if we collapse those big red bars there down to the lower bars, does it kill the conservation signal? Does it affect the how does it affect the cost effectiveness, if I could say that? How does it diminish the cost effectiveness of rooftop solar or distributed solar? How will customers react to this over time? And we're kind of in this now, so maybe Tom has some perspectives on this. How about shifting to time of use rates? We've seen a shift in the demand periods. I participated in a study early 2000s. It's called the Technical Potential or Potential for Renewable Energy in the San Diego region. Tom Bialik from SDG&E, he's an engineer, crunched the numbers and said, hey, I just noticed something. The more solar you put on, the further forward in time, the peak goes. It's kind of like a balloon, right? You squeeze the balloon and the bubble keeps going forward. That was the duck curve, I guess. Tom was like, had his finger on the duck curve earlier than some. So solar changes the way the system works. I mean, I think that's kind of intuitive. So how do time of use rates deal with that? Does it affect the cost effectiveness of rooftop solar? How will customers react? So quickly, economic benefits. What are the benefits of 600 megawatts? I think they're pretty clear. Jobs, money in the San Diego region, the multiplier effect. There have been environmental benefits locally, so criteria pollutants, local air quality, but also less greenhouse gas emissions, which is a global issue. But what are some of the challenges? So again, I'm not going to answer these. I'm going to tee them up, and I think they'll create some fodder for discussion in the panel. Are non-net energy metering customers subsidizing net metering customers? Again, we could spend a week talking about this. There are dissertations written about this, but it's a very important question. Is rooftop solar available to and benefiting all income groups? Are solar customers fairly compensated for the electricity they produce? Is the underlying rate the right amount? If it's 20 cents per kilowatt hour, is that the right amount to be compensating somebody for solar? There are lots of benefit streams that solar produces. Are solar generators being adequately compensated? Are solar customers adequately paying their fair share of the fixed cost of the electric system? Does the NEM successor tariff address some of these issues? Is it enough? People are talking about NEM 2.0. That's why I called it NEM 1.0, because there's got to be something that comes after. There's the successor tariff, but that was, in my mind, it was a stopgap measure that's going to fill the gap. What comes after that? What's the long-term sustainable structure that we can have that we don't need to change every 5 years, that will allow the marketplace for solar to be in place and grow, and let the system grow, and let as much solar happen as we need? How would energy storage affect this? What would the answers to these questions be if we didn't have 600 megawatts but 1,200 megawatts or 2,000 megawatts of solar, which is not crazy in the next, I would say, 15 to 20 years. So what would a sustainable framework look like? Anyway, I wanted that just as a way to kind of throw some things out to you, tell us how we got here, tell us where we are, and tee up some of the questions that I think the panel will be addressing in the next hour or so. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Great job. All right, we are going to go to our first polling question. Keep our fingers crossed this works. Okay, what percentage of power generation comes from net energy metered solar in the SDG&E territory? Over 25%, between 10 and 25%, between 5 and 10%, or less than 5%. Yes, this is a test. Anybody who gets it wrong must sit in the front row. So I'm going to leave this open. You can see the polling goes up. Remember, the last thing that you hit, we have it open the whole time. So the last thing you hit on here is what's going to stick. So next up, while the polling is still open, I want to introduce Heather Werner with One Roof Energy. Heather is the Director of Strategic Initiatives at One Roof and leads their markets and public policy team. One Roof Energy is a complete solar service provider offering homeowners traditional and lease and PPA financing, design and installation, and ongoing operations and system maintenance. Heather is responsible for tracking and engaging policy and regulatory activities at the federal, state, and local levels across solar, distributed generation, and advanced energy industries, and providing operational and strategic guidance on market opportunities and risks. You're important. You are very important. So please join me in welcoming Heather up to the podium. And with the polling closed, pretty much everybody got it right, 47%, between 5 and 10%. Obviously, that number is always changing, but Jim told me between 5 and 10% is correct. So, yeah. So, Heather. Take it away.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to kind of pick up where Scott left off. And so One Roof Energy is a residential solar financing company. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the residential space, but the kind of lessons and concepts in here would also apply to the behind the meter space in commercial and industrial. And fortunately, I have Dan Sullivan here to speak more to that specifically on the panel. But just to give a sense of scale, nationally, this comes from the Solar Market Insight Report that literally just came out from Green Tech Media and the Solar Energy Industries Association. So this is quarters of residential PV installed in the last 6 years. In the last 6 months, residential PV has put 1 gigawatt of power on the national grid. That's huge. In California, I liked this chart because this one was really fun because of the overlay. It's very funny, and I really do enjoy my job, I have to say, and my industry, when I get to say that, yes, residential solar growth in California is flattening around 20% a year. Any investors and financial guys in the room will go, oh, okay, that works. It's very fun to work in my industry right now. What's more interesting about this is that on top of that 20% a year growth is that we're only at about 8%. Now, this isn't your net metering cap issue. This is the percent of the residential market in California that we have actually put panels on. So I got a 92% market opportunity left, and that's just in California. That number, understandably, is slightly worrisome for utilities. And to give everybody a general sense of scale in terms of the built environment in DG in general, nationally, if you put solar panels, just solar, we're not talking wind or anything else like that, if you put just solar panels on the built environment across the country, you'd be covering about 50% of the total national demand for electricity today, just on what already exists in the built environment. So, massive opportunity we are just at the edge of. Now, as Scott has gone through, California has been extremely advanced in where we are with solar. And SDG&E, for a utility, has actually been extremely useful and pleasant to work with as we go through this growth, compared to other utilities in other states, and even some utilities in our state. And some of that has been great in terms of being able to have very, very innovative, conversations regarding where we go next and what this now looks like. And what's also very fun about California is, and if anybody does policy, usually policy is the last thing to come to the table. The market drives something forward, we kind of fight it out, and then eventually policy catches up. Well, in California, we've actually been able to do the opposite of that in clean tech and in renewables in general, which makes it a lot more fun, and it makes it a lot more dynamic, and actually puts us on the cutting edge of finding solutions to our current challenges in ways that other states that are facing penetration, solar penetration like this, haven't. So, in general, I'm going to effectively, this is my last slide, and I'm going to speak to 4 basic principles of distributed generation. And owning and accrediting correctly, I did not come up with these. They were developed by Ben Polis when he was at the Energy Foundation. The first one is very simple. Customers have the right to generate and to save power. Now, everything else in the rest of this debate is fundamentally a debate about that principle. And I'll get into why. We'll get into, it comes around to numbers and finances, and we can all get into the weeds there, but this, accepting this paradigm, changes the entire conversation. So, as an example, in SDG&E, you know, any SDG&E customer knows absolutely that you are getting approximately 33 to 35% of your power from renewable generation. That's the RPS, the Renewable Portfolio Standard. It also is what creates the false dichotomy that Scott talked about with the duck curve. The duck curve is a reflection of a technical challenge of having that much renewable energy, specifically solar, on the grid. Because when the sun goes up, your generation goes up, it doesn't match demand, and then as the sun's going down and generation and load are still up, you have a massive peak, that's the neck of the duck, that you've got to make up for. You've got to generate a massive amount of power in a very, very short amount of time. Now, how many people just with basic math can tell me that we've got from 35% renewables right now, just on the utility side, and we're about to go to 50, that 5% of the distributed generation, if I took it off, you think that neck would get any flatter? So the argument about time of use and the duck curve is a false dichotomy. Principle 2 and Principle 3. Customers that use the grid should help pay for the grid. Customers that provide benefits to the grid should be compensated for those benefits. Now this has been the old school argument around net metering and distributed generation versus utility, which is you use the grid as a solar customer, you are connected to the grid, and at various different times of the day, you are pulling power off the grid. And at various different times of the day, you are putting power on the grid. And there's a cost to that to the utility. It's a hard cost. But there have been multiple studies that show that the net benefit of net metering, in its current structure, is actually a net benefit across all customer classes. It's not just a benefit to homeowners. Now, there are also studies that show the opposite. The reason being is that benefits are extremely difficult to quantify. A great example of this is Nevada, and everybody may have seen the headlines about Nevada and net metering and solar, and oh dear God. 18 months ago, Nevada PUC got a report that showed that net metering in Nevada was a net benefit across all customers by a scale of about $200 to $300 million. 3 months ago, that same PUC got a different report that said, nope, it's actually a $400 million penalty to non-solar customers. Same market, 18 months apart. What's the difference? The difference is the variables. In that in that first report, that report was looking at about 11 different variables of cost versus benefit. Only 2 of them could actually be quantifiable. This is an ongoing discussion and an ongoing challenge that we really have to have. And we have to have it now because, and I know Tom's going to speak to this, we are getting to the point where the investments that the utility has to make are not the old school investments. So how many people saw The Dark Knight? It's the one with Heath Ledger as the Joker. Yeah, right. So Harvey Dent, Eric had a really, really famous line in that movie. He says, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. So let me spend 2 seconds talking about the utility business and revenue model. Right now, the investments that the utility is compensated for drive to load growth and generation. If we are going to talk about the benefits that self-generation talks about, that means that compensation model has to change. And the ownership structure has to change. So future state, and I'm not talking 2 years, I'm talking more like 20, I expect us to have a grid that is plug and play. That every home building has an energy solution that keeps its load as flat as possible, either through self-generation, storage, energy management, and efficiency. And that, as the behind the meter position, is your choice as homeowners. So net metering and volumetric pricing, I will be the first to admit, that is effectively solving the cost and revenue problem for utilities with a machete and a 2x4. Both sides. And if you want us to put those down and start picking up the scalpels, we have to determine how those scalpels are going to be used, what they're really made up of, and how we value them. But most importantly, we have to recognize, back to that very first point, that most of those scalpels are not going to be owned. They might be managed, but they're not going to be the utilities. They're going to be yours. Thank you.
All right. Great job, Heather. I think we're going to have an interesting discussion here in our panel. Okay, so on to our next polling question. And polling has been closed. Here we go. Okay, so polling is open. What is the best vehicle to promote solar while being fair to all constituents? 1, retail net energy metered rates with no fixed charges. 2, retail net energy metered rates with fixed charges. 3, time of use rates. Or 4, fixed rate for solar based on the value it provides to the environment, grid, price stability, etc. So all the answers from here on out are not right or wrong, unless maybe you talk to Tom or Heather or Dan. So we'll leave some time here while I introduce for you guys to answer while I introduce Tom. Tom Brill is Special Counsel and Director of Strategic Projects at SDG&E. Tom is a lawyer practicing in the energy industry for around 30 years and has held a wide range of responsibilities ranging from strategic planning to rate design and regulatory law. Please join me in welcoming Tom to the podium. Okay, first we'll do our results here. So pretty overwhelming majority here voting for fixed rate for solar based on the value that it provides. This will be a pretty interesting topic that we discuss as a panel, because exactly how do you value that? Maybe you even have some thoughts there, Tom.
I might. Good morning, everyone. You know, this is a really good experience for me, but I've got to tell you, the way it came to me was a little bit unusual. On Friday, I was driving to AutoZone. I was on vacation, about 3:30 in the afternoon. Jim Avery called me and he said, "Hey, I've got a speech on Monday morning. Unfortunately, I can't make it. Would you be able to do it?" I'm on vacation today, too, and I just want to let you know that this is how I spend my vacation days. You know, we talk a lot about rate design and cross subsidies and a lot of microscopic issues when we talk about the solar industry. And I'm going to mention all of those because it's part of the discussion. But as I go through my comments, I actually want you to think about something a little bit different, because we're creating a future. We're actually transforming the way energy is produced and consumed. We're doing a lot of things. It's not just solar. It's not just renewables. It's also demand response. It's storage, smart grid technologies. There are a lot of things in our industry that are changing. And so I want you folks to think a little bit further into the future. One question I have for all of you, and I want to ask this before I start just so I can kind of understand who I'm talking to and what you believe, but how many of the people in this room think that we should try to create a grid that would support 100% solar? Renewable or solar? All right, well, that's just about everyone here, and I actually share that objective. And so I want to talk a little bit about what's necessary in my view and in SDG&E's view to do that. Along the road from here to that future, we're going to be talking about a lot of microscopic issues, and those things are not that much fun to talk about. As Scott pointed out, rate design on a Monday morning is kind of tough. We can talk about engineering, we can talk about accounting and finance, and it's a great way to start the week. So my apologies to you, but I also want you to think a little bit macroscopically about the vision that we're moving towards in the future as I go through this. But as Scott pointed out, solar growth has really been significant in San Diego, and to us that's really important. We've adopted a fast-track process. We've made a lot of investments in our grid to facilitate renewable integration, both rooftop, central station, and other types of changes we're seeing on the grid. And that has resulted in cost shifts. I'll talk to you a little bit about what that means and why those are an issue as we move along this bridge to the future. But those are over $200 million a year right now. And what that means is that a customer, for example, who rents and cannot for that reason afford to make a solar investment, it's not their roof, they're not going to do it, they're paying these subsidies to support those customers who own their homes and are making these investments. And so there is, in addition to how do we create the future, there's actually a social equity issue that we've got to be thinking about here. And that is when our more affluent customers avail themselves of options, who should pay for the services they receive? Should that be the customer themselves? Should it be other customers? And how do we move as we grow solar and that $200 million number continues to increase? How do we create equity for all of our customers as we move forward? And how do we make sure that the transition is fair to every one of them? These issues are not just accounting issues. Quite frankly, they go to who pays what and who pays for the services received by which customers. As you think about cost shifts, and I'll talk to you a little bit about that again. I know it's tough on a Monday morning, but for various reasons related to that exciting subject of rate design, I'm gonna have to get into a little bit of it. Residential customers have a cost shift that's 3 times what you would see for a commercial and industrial customer. I'm gonna explain why that occurs, but primarily it's because the peak demand of a residential customer occurs at 8 at night. And it's dark outside at 8 at night. Solar is not generating at 8 at night. And so there has to be certain infrastructure that exists to serve that customer's demand when it's at its peak. The solar is not contributing to serving that demand. That thing that I just talked about, serving that demand, that's capacity. That's the ability to serve demand. The other part of our discussion here is energy. Those are electrons. That's actual electricity. So solar panels generate electricity when the sun shines. Customers consume electricity when they consume it. You have to make sure the electricity that a consumer needs is available when they consume it. So if most of the electricity that they're using is at 8 at night, we have to make sure the infrastructure exists, or that customer has to make sure that the infrastructure exists to serve that demand. And when the utility makes sure that that takes place, the question that we're really talking about is who should pay for that capacity or that infrastructure that is now necessary to serve the demand that a customer has at 8 at night. Is it the customer that benefits from that? Is it another customer? Who should pay that? So that's really, when we talk about cross subsidies, the issue that we're talking about. And so as we move forward and I go through these slides, I'll be talking a little bit about energy and about capacity and about when customers use electricity. And it turns out that residential customers and commercial and industrial customers use electricity at different times. By the way, you know that. When you go to work, you're not using electricity at home, but electricity is being used where you go to work. Well, you're probably working at somewhere that's commercial and industrial, and so you know that that now is where the max demand is. It's happening at those types of facilities. But it's not happening at your home. You've already left home. It's the same case when you're at school. When you get home at night, now you're going to be turning lights on, you're going to be plugging in the iPad, you're going to turn on the air conditioner, that type of stuff. So nothing that I'm really talking about here is complicated. You don't have to be an engineer to understand it. You just have to live life and turn on light switches. You automatically know what I'm talking about. Now, when you look at utility costs, because that's what we're talking about, and I'm sorry for some of the details I have to get into, but it's necessary. We have certain types of costs. We've got costs for electricity. That's the electrons I talked about before. That's what solar panels generate. We've got costs for distribution resources. Now, you'll notice that we don't have a lot of factories in residential neighborhoods. The distribution system is the one that's serving those customers close to the customer. That's about 30% of our costs. We've got transmission resources. Think of big wires delivering electricity to the overall system, commercial and residential customers. And those are fixed costs. Those don't go down when customers stop using them. And we've got public purpose program costs. Think about things that subsidize energy efficiency and implement state policy programs. Those costs cannot be avoided. We continue to incur them when customers use solar. By the way, I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go very quickly here. As you look at this chart, the costs that we avoid when a customer puts solar on the roof are only those commodity energy costs that you see that are not fixed on this chart. The other costs are costs that we're unable to avoid. If we cannot avoid incurring a cost, we have to recover those from customers that we're allowed to charge them to. And so that's what this real issue is about. As we move forward to create this future where we want the ability to move to 100% renewable energy, who's going to pay for the system that makes that future possible? It's got to be paid for to be maintained. Will it be the customers that make solar investments, or will it be customers who are unable to make those investments? When you think about reconciling when people use electricity and when it's being produced, that is the issue of capacity. This is what's happening as solar increases. What we're ending up with is on a cool sunny day, for example, when people are not using electricity, we've got more renewable electricity on the system than we've got electricity demand. We've got to address that somehow. That can be demand response, it can be storage, it can be system resources, it can be stuff that happens behind the meter for the customer. This is another way of depicting this thing that Scott described. It's called the duck curve, but it's basically saying in the middle of the day we've got more electricity than demand. How do we address that situation? This is another way of looking at that. This is looking at a residential customer, and as you look at this, this customer here, I gotta stay near the microphone or I'd point to it, but as you look at a customer that's got solar demand, they're actually using our system a lot more than a customer that does not have solar on the roof. It's interesting to look at how people change electricity demand after they install solar, and I really apologize for having to go through this quickly because these next two slides say a lot. What you'll find is a year after people install solar, 52% of them decrease their maximum hourly demand by about 14%, but 48% increase their maximum hourly demand by an average of 17%. Those fixed costs, the capacity costs that we're talking about, they're the things that utilities use to serve that demand. 2 years later, you actually have 67% of these customers increasing the maximum hourly demand, and now the percentage increases to about 22%. The takeaway is that once people get solar, they don't stop using the system. They don't avoid, and the utility does not avoid having to have capacity available on the distribution system and the transmission system to provide reliable service to those customers. Those needs continue and actually can increase. The question that we really have before us, if we want to move to a world where 100% of the energy can be renewable, is how do we maintain the system necessary to make that possible, and who should pay to make sure that that system is available so that we can actually achieve these policy goals. Thank you very much.
Okay, this time I'd like to invite all of our panelists to come have a seat so we can get into the meat of the discussion. First, we'll move on to our next audience polling question. How do you promote efficiency in our power markets? Okay, so when we get to the question here, this is really from the perspective of overall efficiency, understanding that solar does have an impact on our grid, and efficiency here would include infrastructure costs, maintenance costs, and pricing. So polling is open. Number one is leave rates alone. Number two, establish rates to reflect different prices during the day, depending on the strain and stress that energy users place on the system. And three is institute a fixed tariff for solar power generated, with fixed pricing being adjusted as milestones are hit for the amount of solar that are being put on the grid, year by year or every 5 years over time. So I would like to make an introduction here to Dan Sullivan. Dan is the president and founder of San Diego-based Sullivan Solar Power. He has been a key driving force for the growth of solar industry in Southern California for the past 12 years. And his company is a primary contributor to San Diego's ranking as one of the top solar markets in the country. So welcome, Dan, to the panel here. All right, so overwhelmingly, establish rates to reflect different prices during the day, depending on the stress and strain on the system. So this is He's on? Okay, great. So this is really getting at the heart of the matter. I think, Tom, do you want to, or Heather, maybe you can respond to maybe your reaction to this, these results here, and your reaction to the question in general?
I mean, I can project, but it's probably easier this way. I would agree. I think the opportunity, I think the challenge with always looking at stress, strain, costs is it minimizes the other side of the equation, which is to say there are cost benefits, there are opportunities to provide benefit for the grid. So if I can spend money, invest, finance, et cetera, a solution at my end, be it residential or on an institutional building, that removes that strain and stress, should that just be an avoided cost, or is that a benefit that I'm providing to the utility? And that means that rate structure, I mean, the good news is you can do that, and rate structures then will define what technology solution I use at any specific point of stress or strain. So it doesn't solve the revenue problem. It may solve the cost shift problem simply because that all you're doing is adding benefit. You're just removing cost.
So does it remove, I mean, Tom, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Does it remove the strain and stress?
You know, I'm actually really impressed with the audience that this was the answer that they chose. And the reason I'm impressed is because if you have price signals where prices are higher when the costs to serve demand are higher, that causes customers to want to use less electricity at that point in time. And what that does is it reduces the amount of infrastructure that needs to be built to serve that demand. And then we have fewer environmental issues associated with that construction. And we also have fewer environmental issues associated with generation of the electricity, because when prices are highest, you're using the least efficient machines that have the highest emissions and the rest. And so these types of price signals actually make a lot of sense. They cause solar customers to put the solar on the side of the roof that's going to create the greatest system benefit. And if the credit the customer receives is based upon the actual cost the utility avoids, and the utility avoids a greater cost during certain times of the day than it would at other times of the day, this actually naturally passes through that incentive to the customer, and it leads to what they call economic efficiency. The one point that I want to add in response to Heather's comment, and this is a misconception a lot of folks have, SDG&E does not earn money off of electricity generation or selling electricity to customers. We don't have higher earnings when we sell more electricity and lower earnings when we sell less electricity. That actually goes back to the 1990s and electricity restructuring in California, where we started something called direct access to give customers the ability to buy their own electricity from a third-party marketer. And so utilities got out in California of the generation ownership business. And prior to that, we actually had some rate design changes that made us agnostic to increases or decreases in demand, because that was to create incentives to support energy efficiency. So when you look at overall electricity demand, our earnings don't go up or down based upon how many electrons we sell to customers, but what you're really talking about is, on this question, the time value of demand is not just energy commodity, but it's also capacity. How much capacity do we need to serve that peak, depending on when it happens?
All fair points. Dan had a smile going on over there that I want to get a reaction to.
I always love SDG&E talking point. So with respect, Tom, how does SDG&E make its money? It's the recovery of infrastructure developments such as the Sunrise Power Link, which is a $2 billion project. Interestingly enough, the 600 megawatt plus that we have in SDG&E's territory has a value of about $2 billion that's been deployed. So when we talk about cost shifts and we talk about benefits, the amount of solar that's been deployed in SDG&E's territory, we're going to approach 700 megawatts in a couple of years, or probably within a year. That's a massive power plant that nobody's talking about, that SDG&E didn't pay for, doesn't maintain, but benefits from. When you talk about value of an electron, the value of an electron when it's located at its load, or the house or business that's consuming that electron or that kilowatt hour, is higher, arguably, than an electron that's located 100 miles away that has to be transmitted across SDG&E's power lines that they have to build and then get a return on investment on. So what's missed in this dialogue, having been a party to many of these at this point, is the question, is a centralized utility model really the method that we need to use to reach our renewable energy goals? Do we need to have a broader discussion about business practices in our territory, in our state, in our nation? There's a default belief that a private-owned utility or investor-owned utility is the means to deliver our goals. Maybe that's not what we should be doing. Because what you have here is one business model disrupting another business model. And so we sit here and we talk about rates and what's fair and cost shift. What we're really talking about is how to help SDG&E figure out a way to survive in a new world order where customers are generating their own power. So maybe we need to open this conversation up to, is utility, a centralized utility, the best method for our society to reach our goals?
That's a great question, Dan. Scott, I want to get some opinion here from you. Usually you're all fact, but we need opinion.
Yeah, I'll
On that specifically, I'd love to get your
I'm
thoughts.
going to hew to fact, I think. But so I think this is a key question, is, what is the future system or business model look like? I mean, I really think that Dan put his finger on something important. However, I would also say, I would caution us to fall into this either or. Heather talked about false dichotomies. I'm not sure it's an either or. We have very aggressive greenhouse gas targets in California. Those are, in my mind, kind of the overarching. Carbon has become, again, here's some opinion. Carbon has become the kind of overarching policy overlay. Other main energy policies in California, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, the energy efficiency targets, reduction in fossil fuels for transportation, they all serve this bigger issue. And so the question is, I think in terms of carbon. I still think in terms of energy, but I think in terms of carbon. In other words, the question isn't how much renewable energy can we get. The question is, how can we get carbon reductions? And if it's better to get carbon better, however you define that, cheaper, faster, smarter, fairer, to do it with renewables at the large scale, then we should look at it. If there's a role for solar to play or other distributed energy to play at the distributed level, the so-called behind the meter, we should look at it. My guess is, if history is any guide, they're both going to be part of the solution. I look at it as both and, not either or. I can't think of examples in the energy business where there's this just bright line where it's either this or that. It generally doesn't go that way. Currently, about half the solar installed in California, and I'm going off memory here, is about half is distributed, half is behind the meter, roughly. Heather brought up the good point. Is the glass half full or is the glass half empty? 33% renewable. All of that is, all or most of that is large scale. Just behind the meter does not count at this point toward those renewable portfolio goals. We're going to 50%. Solar is 5% or less on an energy basis. So I'm not saying it's good or bad. I'm just, some people look at that and say, well, solar's really small. And then some people look at that and say, there's a huge business opportunity. I think the point is that going forward, we're going to have both. One quick point on the market side, just to throw out another kind of bombshell, is that some people are talking about, so if you look at the utilities, I think that historically, utilities had a natural monopoly. They were vertically integrated. They generated, they transmitted, and they distributed electricity. In 2016, I would argue that the utilities' remaining natural monopoly is the distribution system, or the grid, but the distribution system in particular. So you can now get your power from SolarCity. Certain customers can get their power from direct access providers. There is a growing interest in community choice aggregation in our region. Those are all alternative commodity providers. So I think that there's been competition, maybe not as much as some people would like, but you can get your electricity from other providers. And so what's left is the distribution system. I don't think we're ever going to get rid of the distribution system. I also think that one more point, and then we'll move on, is that people are talking about defecting the grid. We're going to cut the cord and leave the grid. And I think that will be technically possible, but I'm not sure that it makes sense in the big scheme of things. I think it makes more sense to have a grid, an interconnected network, rather than a bunch of autonomous providers.
Okay, so I do want to give Tom a chance to respond to that, just in all fairness, but I do want to do a polling question first, which is, all right, so polling is open. How should utilities be incentivized and compensated? I think it's germane to the topic we're discussing right now. 1, achievement of renewable energy targets. 2, implementation of energy efficiency programs and targets. 3, based on grid stability, reliability. 4, achievement of decreased energy usage targets. So while everybody's responding, Tom, if you wanna give a response specifically to what Dan was asking about the role of the utility.
And Dan and I have had the opportunity to have these discussions before. We always enjoy it. If I was selling solar, I would focus the way Dan is, because the more the NEM credit, the greater the subsidy, the more solar you can sell. If I was trying to create a future that would support 100% renewables, or if I was trying to protect customers that don't own homes and can't buy solar, I'd be thinking about slightly different issues. And quite frankly, the state of California has to think about both. Scott pointed out the history of the CSI program, which was a form of incentives, and it was designed to stimulate short-term market growth, but eventually have the incentives go away as the market matured and as solar started to grow. It's the same thing with the utility grid and really the PC world. Think about how we started with PCs, and that was the best thing, and now cloud computing people look at as far more economically efficient. We may see the same type of thing happening on the electricity world. The one key difference between the broadband industry and the electricity market, and this is absolutely key, for telephone companies, the fiber infrastructure, the copper infrastructure that they had when the broadband market came into play, that was really not useful to support a broadband market. And so as they had to transition the telecom industry to high-speed broadband, their existing network really couldn't support it. That's not the case with the grid that our customers have been helping to pay for over a century. Our grid actually, with very few updates, is the most cost-effective battery that exists. And what I mean by that is when a customer generates electricity at 12 in the afternoon and they consume that electricity at 8 at night, the most cost-effective way of making that happen, reconciling the difference between that solar generation and the customer demand, is the utility distribution system, as Scott pointed out. That's today. Customers have the ability to do it on their own with a battery behind the meter. It's more expensive, but the ability exists. But the question is, if we want to support a world that can go to 100% renewable, how do we reconcile generation and when it occurs with when electricity is consumed? And right now, the grid is the most cost-effective way to do that, and based upon economies of scope and scale, I actually think that'll be the case for a long time.
Okay, Dan, I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and then maybe also touch on battery storage and what you guys are doing. But first, let me give you a little reaction in case. So that's interesting. Grid stability and reliability, the vast majority.
Heather and I think there should have been a 5, all the above. So I need to clarify something I said earlier, and that's about competing business models. I think the grid is absolutely crucial for our society. The question I'm asking, because it's so crucial, and we have such high goals for renewable energy, should that grid be owned by a private entity or an investor-owned utility? Or should it be a public utility? Our roads are crucial to our economy. Our roads are maintained by our government. Now, I'm a business owner. I'm not interested in making everything publicly owned, but something where we are trying to move away from carbon, where we're trying to reduce exporting dollars to countries that want to see our demise. All these things that we're trying to do, is a utility that's a subsidiary of a fossil fuel company our best choice for moving towards renewables? And I would guess the answer is no. At least that's my viewpoint. A lot of people in my industry share that viewpoint. As for this cross-subsidy discussion, solar power produces, in the middle of the day, producing power when the system needs it the most. Now, the system is a blend of residential, commercial, and industrial loads. And when a residential system is producing power in the middle of the day, it is, as Scott pointed out, pushing that demand to later in the day. So that is a massive benefit to our region, our state, and our country. It is that benefit that is at debate here, is how valuable is that? So when Tom speaks to paying for infrastructure costs and net metered customers get a massive cross subsidy, I feel as though he fails to mention something very fundamental here, is that we don't have to send SDG&E a check to provide them benefits or to pay for the use of the grid. We're providing them compensation through the services we provide the grid. So I think that clarifies my points.
So I want to hit on something that Scott just said, because I agree in terms of the one area where you do need a centralized control, one central manager, is your distribution grid. To Dan's point, that doesn't necessarily have to be an investor-owned business. But one of the things that is lost in then talking about capacity costs and maintaining that grid is the assumption that all of the costs and benefits of doing that should also therefore be controlled, maintained, compensated, and incentivized to the same entity. Whereas if we want to use broadband as an example, yes, I have a cost because I pay UVerse for my internet. And I can plug and play as much or as little data that I need on that, and I need that data when I need it. So the time component and the location component, most people who work in tech can tell you it's always much more fun to be working next to a fiber node because your power and your speed is a hell of a lot faster. So, however, then I've got a lot more control about how much data I'm pulling, that type of pass-through, et cetera. So whereas you need one centralized manager of the grid, the benefits, the costs for capacity maintenance are not necessarily have to be borne by that same centralized person, or it can be solutioned by everyone else who's connected to the grid. And the idea that we are structuring this, or that all of those capacity charges, one, don't all show up the same way, to Dan's point. The SDG&E ISO peak, the peak on SDG&E, the absolute peak every year, and it continues to be through 2015, is about somewhere between 12 and 2 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of August. So all of those benefits aren't calculated correctly, and they're all assumed to be at the cost or the incentive to one centralized entity, and they don't have to be.
On that, so Tom, hold that microphone. On that cost issue, because you put up a number on there on the slide, 200 million, the amount of the subsidy. I'd love to if you could help the audience wrap their brain around that number, even just conceptually, I think that would be very, very helpful. Before you do that, we have our last polling question up here. I'm not going to read it in the interest of time, so you guys can go ahead and polling is open, so you can read that and answer it while Tom, if you don't mind, addressing that cost issue.
Yeah, let me try to do it relatively. How many of you remember the energy crisis in California? Raise your hand. It was expensive. The state of California ended up buying a lot of electricity for customers in the state for a whole lot of reasons related to a dysfunctional electricity market. And that's created a debt that we're still paying for, billions of dollars. By way of order of magnitude, the subsidy from the NEM net energy metering 1.0 rate design is over 2 times the DWR bond cost that resulted from the energy crisis. So that's just the NEM 1.0 part of this. We're now in 2.0. So these dollars are very significant. That's at small levels of penetration. So if you want to focus on subsidies and what's that mean by way of order of magnitude or relationship to history, that's a good way to look at it. But I still keep coming back to, what do we need to support the future we're trying to create? And once you decide what it is we need to support that future, then these issues we're talking about right now are, okay, who should pay for that? And if a service is provided by a utility to a customer, who should pay for that service, that customer or another customer? And if a customer, because I agree with what Dan says, if a customer provides a benefit to the utility, shouldn't that customer be paid for it? Turns out that if the customer is paid or credited based upon the cost the utility avoids, and if that cost is different at one time of the day than it is at a different time of the day, that customer is actually getting compensated for the benefit they're creating to the grid. And so now we get into a lot of economic and financial issues. It's called accurate price signals. But if net energy metering credits are based upon the actual cost of services provided by the utility to that customer, and that accounts for the benefits the customer is providing to the grid. We can all debate about what that is, but if that's the way it's developed, then we actually could have a system that would support 100% renewables.
Okay.
This customer benefit cost at that single point. But what Dan's talking about is system. There's a benefit to the system that has nothing to do with the avoided cost at the time that I'm using electricity or not. That 200 million is a single point load center. But the value of distributed generation and distributed power is systemic. So it's the value to the system. It's not the avoided cost just to that delivery point.
This is why we only have one microphone. This is also why I talked about when residential customers and commercial and industrial customers use electricity at the beginning of the day. It is true we have a system. And it is true that the system peak is moving to later in the day. And I think Dan pointed out one of the reasons for that is increased solar generation. And that's true from a system perspective. However, for the past 30 years, residential customers served off of the distribution circuit. For 30 years, their peak demand has occurred at 8 p.m. And so when you build the distribution circuit that serves residential customers, for the last 30 years, and it's continuing, we have to build it. We incur the cost based upon what's necessary to serve the demand that occurs at 8 p.m. We don't build it based upon deliveries of DG to the grid for the most part. We've had to do some upgrades to deal with power quality issues and things like that. But for the most part, we're building it to meet that 8 p.m. demand, and we have been for 30 years. And so when you talk about at a point, location, that's why we have customer classes. So residential customers at that location, at any location, they have a peak at 8 p.m. And so you have a tariff for residential customers. Right now, it's not based upon when they use electricity. They use it at a different time of day, and they have a different peak demand than commercial and industrial customers. That's why we have a different tariff for them. And quite frankly, if those price signals were accurate based upon the costs that we incur to serve those customers, the net energy metering credit that they receive would also be accurate.
Okay, so hold on one second. Let me just get the results of the poll here. So, wow, that's interesting. So it's basically split between 2 and 3 here. Yeah, so I did want to move it to Scott real quick, and I'll hand it over to you, Dan. But you talked a little bit about long-term solutions, rate design? How do we do this moving forward? You've done tons of research. What do you think, given with storage technology and all the issues we're talking about today, what is a viable path forward? How do we get there?
Discussion by saying that there was a lot of fog outside. I'm going to stick with my foggy crystal ball, but let me just maybe a little bit more opinion on this topic is, what I was saying earlier, I didn't quite finish my point about the distribution system. There are some people saying, the distribution system is, you need the distribution system. We want a plug-and-play system. What if we had a manager of the distribution system that would act kind of like the ISO does for the transmission system and be the kind of orchestrator, or that's the right word, the conductor of the orchestra of all these distributed energy, and plan and determine where it should go and that kind of things, or at least encourage that. So it's called the distribution system operator. John Wellinghoff, former FERC commissioner, has kind of been pushing this concept. So it's, they manage the utility. Under this scenario, the utility would own and operate the system just like they do their transmission system. But this distribution system operator, which would be presumably a nonprofit or a government organization, basically like the ISO, would run it, would dispatch it, so to speak. And I mean, it's a provocative idea. I think it has lots of interesting pieces to it. I guess maybe long-term thinking, I wonder if rate structures are the right mechanism for these things. Now, obviously, we're not going to get away from rate structures, but is it possible that, so this distribution system operator concept, there are different flavors of it. So you have, just the traffic cop idea, and then on the far extreme, you have this distribution system operator operating a market of distributed energy attributes. So if the utility, there aren't the same attributes at the transmission level as you have at the distribution level, but if the system needs something that the distributed energy resources can provide, they should be compensated. Now, rates are blunt instruments. I think even time of use rates, even really good refined rates, they're kind of blunt instruments. And I don't know that we're going to get away from them anytime soon. But again, longer term, is there a way for this compensation to be a bit dynamic, I would say? So, if there's a congestion on a particular circuit, could you get a premium for providing certain services on that circuit? Again, I don't know the pathway to get there, but these are some of these longer-term kind of provocative ideas that have been thrown out to figure this out. I mean, it's very complicated. So
yeah, a little bit of the carrot or the stick.
Yeah.
Right? So I want to move this over to Dan. I know he wanted to make a comment here, and I think we are probably out of time. But one last comment here by
Great.
Dan.
So, what's that? Okay. To Scott's point, an independent operator for the distribution grid is probably the direction I believe we need to go. And we need to get away from fossil fuel interests managing our grid. That's not going to get us to where we need to go. So there's a lot of talk about subsidy. And so this is a question for Tom. For a 5 kilowatt residential system that gets installed, what cost does SDG&E incur? What upgrades does SDG&E do, if any? And then the next question I have for Tom is that $200 million round number is awfully familiar to me, and that was roughly the number that was floated around before rate reform. And we have now had rate reform. We've collapsed the tiers, reduced the differential. So why is it the subsidy hasn't gone away? Because that was the justification for the rate reform at the petitioning of the utilities. And further, we've reduced the benefit of net metering and net metering 2.0, which is the market that we are operating in today. So between rate restructure and net metering restructure, how is it that $200 million number hasn't moved? Because that was the justification for both. So first question, 5 kilowatt system gets installed, how much money do you spend to upgrade the grid? Second question, how come your subsidy hasn't moved despite the fact that we redid all the rates?
All right, so I take that back. We'll end with Tom's remarks.
I tried to make you the cleanup hitter, Dan. You just gave that one away. So the customer, the 5 kW system, this is kind of how I look at life. Yeah, you can look short term. I'm actually looking more long term. What cost? Well, that customer's that customer, I'm assuming residential, has had a peak demand at 8 p.m. for the last 30 slides. Dad's holding the button. But based upon the slides I showed earlier, that customer's peak demand at 8 p.m. is actually higher than it was before they put in solar to you. Is for the capacity to serve that customer's 8 p.m. demand. The system
Oh, okay. And the second question was, how come the $200 million number hasn't shifted despite rate reform and net metering reform?
Well, you don't want this to work all the way, do you? This stuff gets really complicated. The $200 million number was based upon analysis we did when we first produced that number. That was before we'd reached the cap. Solar penetration's grown since then. Rates continue to increase. Overall, the revenue requirement goes up. So your individual rate design for upper tiers is not going to escalate at the level it would have escalated. They adopted a new SUI rate, super user energy surcharge, which is kind of a tier 3 rate. So you still continue, which go too much deeper into the spreadsheet because people.
All right, but just to hit the salient points though. So a 5 kilowatt system has no cost to the grid, the actual installation of it. And then the other part was the $200 million number has not been updated since the tiers have been adjusted and net metering has been adjusted, is what I heard you just say.
You talked about one individual unit as opposed to a number of them. And as you know, I know, you can have power quality inverters issues depending upon the inverters that you're using. There can be other interconnection costs that we incur. Those were just litigated in a CPUC proceeding. So yes, there are going to be some interconnection costs. But the biggest cost that I'm focused on for the purposes of my discussion are the costs that we need to continue to cover to keep the system together, to ensure that customers that don't own homes, they're not rich, that they continue to get reliable electricity service. And how do you maintain all of the social responsibilities we have as a society to every one of our citizens so that they have electricity at a reasonable cost?
Okay, I'm going to hit one myth that you just hit, and then I promise, Jason, I won't give them a mic again, which is the idea that solar is only available for the wealthy is complete bull. The whole purpose of solar financing, the cost of solar coming down at that spike, et cetera, is that most of our customers these days are middle income. So that argument is false. The other is that the reality is this idea of subsidy is, again, a false premise, just in terms of the term, because in reality, if I put a solar system on my house, his bill does not go up. The only way his bill goes up is if you go to the PUC and ask for a rate increase. The only way his rate doesn't increase, you don't go from 21 cents to 22 cents because I have solar on my roof. As a residential customer, yes, but you still have to go to the PUC to balance them out. You don't charge him more. Right, in rate cases, you go to the PUC to get them balanced. All of that is at the PUC decision. So if the PUC said no, his rate still wouldn't go up. The assumption is that he's subsidizing me. But if his rates are going up because the PUC said yes, his rates can go up so that you guys get more money, he's not subsidizing me. He's subsidizing you.
This is why this gets complicated. Our time's up.
Why don't we do this?
I do want to say, I just want to make 2 quick points. 50% of our customers don't own homes. No matter what financing is available, they're not going to buy a solar system for their landlord, and most of them move every year. We have to take care of those folks. And our fixed costs that we incur, the rates in California were decoupled over 25 years ago, which basically means automatically our fixed costs. That is, they did not want to have utilities earn more money by encouraging customers to use more electricity. And so decoupling was adopted to support energy efficiency, so utilities are agnostic to whether electricity demand increases or decreases. That just happens automatically to ensure that we have the right system.
Okay, so what I want to do is I want to give each of you 15 seconds, that's it, with a thought to leave everybody with the most germane point that you guys can make. If you already made yours, that's fine.
15 seconds, that's rough. Okay, so the solar that's installed in SDG&E's territory, I just want to leave you with this, is worth over $2.4 billion of private investment that SDG&E benefits from. Using a blended rate of 22 cents per kilowatt hour produced, that is $264 million in energy deployed to the grid by private producers. If we want to talk to subsidy, San Diegans are subsidizing SDG&E each and every day. The other thing that we need to really be thinking about is avoiding getting on utility talking points and getting into the weeds about rates, because we all can be misled down that path. Is a private entity the best mechanism to deliver our renewable energy goals for maintenance of the grid? It's not a foreign concept to have a municipal utility or a publicly owned utility, and then, to Heather's point, having a plug-and-play grid where there is no vested interest in fossil fuel generation, Sempra Energy, and we can move away from fossil fuels and the havoc that it's reaping on our society. Thank you.
The idea of a plug-and-play grid, the idea of anything having to do with distributed generation, self-generation, and the customer's right to do that, whether it be to generate, to save, or to store, fundamentally has value, and that value should be quantified and compensated. Right now, our system does not do that. The only quantifiable values are costs. Until we figure out how to balance that equation, current rate structures are not going to accurately reflect costs, capacity, value, or systemic solutions.
I've talked enough. I'll just say, let's create a market that will support the future that we all say we're trying to create, instead of focusing on short-term issues.
See, I told you, thunder and fog. Those were going to be my last words, but so last words are an interesting tension that we have in California. I would say policy tension. So at the same time that the California ISO is looking to expand its footprint and creating energy imbalance markets to bring in solar from around the West, or I'm sorry, renewables from around the West, there is also, policy that's driving this distributed energy increase to happen. So I think it's a tension. I don't think it's an either or. I think it's a both and.
All right, well, thank you everybody for staying. Thank you to the panelists. And feel free to network and ask any questions. Thank you for coming on. Jason, if you want to say anything.
Sorry for going over. We never do that. Important topic.